19 years ago, a millionaire abandoned his wife after learning she couldn't have children. But at a gala, his world crumbles. She's there, standing beside 3 young men who look exactly like him. How is this possible? She was infertile, wasn't she? As secrets unravel and danger looms, he's forced to face the truth. Will he fight for his empire or for the family he never knew existed? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Eleanor Caldwell's hand trembled as she gripped the fertility clinic's report. The words blurred through her tears, but their meaning remained painfully clear. She would never carry a child. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Caldwell." The doctor's voice seemed to come from miles away. "Your condition means pregnancy would be impossible." Richard sat beside her, his face a mask of composure that didn't reach his eyes. His fingers, once intertwined with hers, had gone slack. "There are options," the doctor continued. "Surrogacy with your own eggs, adoption." "Thank you, doctor." Richard's voice cut through the haze. "We need time." The drive home passed in silence. Eleanor stared out the window, remembering how different things had been just 5 years ago. 5 years earlier. "I want at least 3. Richard had whispered against her neck as they swayed on their wedding night. The hotel balcony overlooked the Mediterranean. Stars scattered above them like promises. Eleanor laughed, tilting her head back. 3? That's specific. "A dynasty needs numbers," he teased, but his blue eyes held something serious. "My father had nothing to leave me, but our children will have everything." She pressed her palm against his chest. "Our children will have love. That's the real legacy." He'd kissed her then, deeply, passionately, as if sealing a pact. Now, Eleanor watched Richard pace their living room, his tall frame casting long shadows across the furniture they'd chosen together. "We can still have a family," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My eggs are viable. With a surrogate, it's not the same." Richard stopped pacing, staring at the family portrait of his business partners and their children that sat on the mantel. "I need continuity." Continuity. The word stung. "Children aren't business assets, Richard. You know that's not what I meant." But his eyes wouldn't meet hers. The following weeks brought a growing distance. Richard worked later, came home with less to say. Eleanor researched options, filled their home with pamphlets on surrogacy and adoption. They sat untouched on his nightstand. One night, she found him in their home office, staring at old family photos. His mother, his grandparents. "I'm the last one," he said without looking up. "When I'm gone, there's nothing left of them either." Eleanor knelt beside his chair. "A child from a surrogate would be ours. Yours, biologically." His fingers traced his grandfather's face in the yellowed photograph. "I need to know my child is being carried by the woman I—" He stopped. "The woman you what, Richard?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. He finally looked at her, his expression remote. "I need something you can't give me." The words hung between them, impossible to take back. The decision wasn't announced so much as it materialized, like a wall being built brick by brick until they couldn't see each other anymore. "I've found an apartment downtown," Richard said one morning over coffee, "close to the office." Eleanor set her cup down carefully. "Is this temporary?" His silence was answer enough. Their last night together, Richard packed methodically while Eleanor watched from the doorway of their bedroom. His movements were precise, efficient, like everything else about him. "We could still try," she said softly. The surrogate agency said, "Eleanor." Her name on his lips sounded like goodbye. "You deserve someone who can accept what life has given you. And you deserve someone who can give you what you want." The words tasted bitter. When the last suitcase was closed, Richard stood before her. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw the struggle behind his eyes. His hand reached out, hesitant, touching her cheek with unexpected tenderness. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his palm one last time. "I did love you," he whispered. "I know." She stepped back, dignity straightening her spine despite the pain crushing her chest. "That's what makes this worse." Richard's fingers lingered on her face for a heartbeat longer. Then he picked up his bags and walked out of their home, choosing his vision of legacy over the love they'd built. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching his car disappear down the street. She didn't call after him. She didn't collapse. Instead, she closed the door quietly and faced her empty house alone, heartbroken but unbowed. 19 years later, Richard Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, 40 stories above Manhattan. The city sprawled before him like a glittering circuit board, each light representing connections and lives intertwined, connections he had failed to maintain in his own life. At 52, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored tuxedo, salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish. Caldwell Developments now commanded respect across 3 continents. The name that had once belonged to a small-time contractor's son was now emblazoned on skylines. "Mr. Caldwell?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your car will be ready in 20 minutes. Richard pressed the button. "Thank you, Vanessa." Vanessa had been with him for 6 years, longer than any of his relationships since Eleanor. She was efficient, anticipating his needs with clinical precision. She knew his schedule, his business preferences, even how he took his coffee. But she didn't know him. No one did anymore. He moved through his penthouse, all clean lines and modern furnishings. Architectural Digest had featured it last year. Bachelor's Paradise, the ultimate urban retreat. The article failed to mention how the space echoed when he returned home each night. In his bedroom, Richard opened his safe to retrieve his grandfather's watch, a tradition for important events. Behind the Patek, Philippe lay a small, worn photograph he rarely allowed himself to look at. Tonight, something made him pause. Eleanor's smile looked back at him from their trip to Santorini. The Mediterranean sun had lightened her hair, and her eyes crinkled at the corners with genuine joy. He remembered taking the photo, remembered her laughing and telling him to put the camera away and enjoy the sunset. "Mr. Caldwell?" Vanessa's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, tablet in hand. "I have the final speech for tonight's gala. Would you like to review it once more?" Richard slipped the photo back into the safe. "No need. I know what I'm announcing." The Caldwell Plaza project is generating significant buzz. The Times is sending their real estate correspondent. "Good." He closed the safe with a decisive click. "This will be the capstone of everything I've built." Vanessa nodded, her expression professional. "Your 8 o'clock with Ms. Winters has been confirmed for tomorrow morning." Richard suppressed a sigh. Diane Winters, his 4th attempt at a relationship in 3 years. Beautiful, accomplished, 15 years his junior. They'd been seeing each other for 6 months, and he still felt nothing beyond a pleasant companionship. "Cancel it," he said abruptly. Vanessa's eyebrow rose slightly, the most emotion she ever displayed. "May I ask why?" "It's not going anywhere. We both know it." He adjusted his cufflinks. "Send flowers, something appropriate." "Of course." She made a note, unfazed. This wasn't the first relationship she'd helped him end. Alone again, Richard poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, swirling the amber liquid. Tonight should feel triumphant. Caldwell Plaza would be his masterpiece, a sustainable, mixed-use development that would redefine urban living. The project that would cement his legacy. Legacy. The word that had cost him everything that mattered. He drained the glass in one swallow, welcoming the burn. What good was a legacy with no one to share it? No one to leave it to? His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. Richard moved toward the door, pausing at the mirror for a final check. The man who stared back had everything he'd ever wanted professionally and nothing he truly needed personally. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. Coming home to Eleanor, perhaps with children's laughter echoing through the halls. The phantom of possibility haunted him briefly before he banished it. "Time to go," he murmured to his reflection. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying him down from his solitary perch toward the waiting crowd, the speeches, the handshakes, and false smiles. Another night of being Richard Caldwell, real estate magnate, while the man behind the name remained hidden, alone with his regrets and the hollow victory his empire represented. One warm evening, the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel glittered with chandeliers and the sparkle of designer jewelry. Richard moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on his latest triumph. The charity gala had attracted Chicago's elite, exactly the audience he needed for tonight's announcement. "Richard, magnificent turnout," said Mayor Thompson, clapping him on the shoulder. "The city's excited about your new project." "Thank you, Mayor. We're breaking ground next month." Richard smiled his public smile, the one that appeared in business magazines and press conferences. "The environmental impact studies exceeded our expectations." "Always ahead of the curve, aren't you?" The mayor chuckled before being pulled away by another donor. Richard accepted a flute of champagne from a passing server. These events were second nature to him now. The small talk, the strategic connections, the careful balance of confidence and humility that wealthy donors responded to. He'd perfected the art of being present while keeping part of himself detached, observing the room like a chessboard. The MC announced dinner would be served in 20 minutes, and Richard used the moment to survey the room. His gaze swept past tables of potential investors, city officials, and he froze. Across the ballroom, standing near one of the tall windows, was Eleanor. 19 years had treated her kindly. Her hair, once chestnut brown, now had elegant streaks of silver at the temples, styled in soft waves that framed her face. She wore a midnight blue gown that complemented her figure without trying to disguise her age. She looked confident, composed, beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten. But it wasn't Eleanor alone that made Richard's hand tremble, nearly spilling his champagne. Surrounding her were 3 young men, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, tall, with the same athletic build Richard had had at their age. One laughed at something another said, throwing his head back in a gesture so familiar that Richard felt disoriented. They had his jawline, his eyes, that distinctive Caldwell blue. Even the way one of them stood, hands in pockets, weight shifted slightly to one side, was like looking at himself in a time mirror. Richard's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. One of the young men leaned down to say something in Eleanor's ear, and she smiled up at him with unmistakable maternal pride. The resemblance between them was minimal. They had her smile, perhaps, but to Richard, they were unmistakably, impossibly his. Eleanor must have felt his stare. She turned, her eyes meeting his across the crowded room. For a moment, time suspended between them. No recognition flickered in her expression, no surprise, only a composed acknowledgement. She gave him a slight, dignified nod, neither inviting nor rejecting, before turning back to the young men. "Mr. Caldwell," his assistant appeared at his elbow. "They're ready for you to take your place at the head table." Richard couldn't move. "Who is that woman?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Vanessa followed his gaze. "Eleanor Caldwell, I believe. She's on the hospital foundation board. Would you like an introduction?" Caldwell. She'd kept his name. And those young men, who were they? How could they exist? "Mr. Caldwell," Vanessa prompted. "Your speech is in 15 minutes. Richard forced himself to move, his legs wooden as he followed his assistant to the head table. His mind raced with impossible calculations. 19 years. The young men looked about 19. Eleanor couldn't have children. That had been the whole reason he'd left. Unless... the embryos. They'd created embryos during their fertility treatments. He'd signed papers relinquishing his rights when he left, barely reading them in his haste to start his new life. The realization hit him with physical force. Eleanor had used their embryos. She'd found a surrogate. She'd raised his sons, their sons, without him. Throughout dinner, Richard barely tasted the expensive cuisine. His eyes kept returning to Eleanor's table, watching the easy interaction between her and the three young men. His sons. The word echoed in his mind, foreign and familiar all at once. When the MC called him to the podium, Richard rose on autopilot. He stood before the crowd, his carefully prepared speech about Caldwell Plaza, suddenly meaningless. The notes in his hand might as well have been written in a foreign language. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice hollow to his own ears. "Thank you for your support tonight." His gaze found Eleanor again. She was watching him now, her expression unreadable. Beside her, one of the young men whispered something to his brother, both studying Richard with curious eyes that matched his own. Richard's carefully prepared speech dissolved into mechanical platitudes. His eyes kept drifting to Eleanor's table, making him lose his place repeatedly. The crowd's polite applause barely registered as he fumbled through his conclusion. And so, with Caldwell Plaza, we hope to redefine the city skyline while creating a legacy that will... His voice faltered as one of the young men, his son, leaned over to whisper something that made Eleanor smile. A legacy that will endure for generations. Thank you. He stepped away from the podium, ignoring the hand of the charity director who approached to thank him. Richard moved through the crowd with single-minded purpose, nodding distractedly at those who tried to engage him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached Eleanor's table. She saw him coming. Her posture straightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle armor being donned. The three young men noticed her reaction and turned to follow her gaze. "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice hoarse despite his attempt at composure. "Richard," her voice was steady, controlled. "It's been a long time." The silence between them stretched, weighted with 19 years of absence. "You look well," he managed finally. "Thank you." She offered nothing more, no reciprocation, no warmth. Richard's eyes moved to the three young men who were watching this exchange with increasing curiosity. "Mom?" one of them prompted, his questioning gaze moving between Eleanor and Richard. Eleanor's smile was gentle as she turned to them. "Boys, this is Richard Caldwell. Richard, these are my sons, James, Thomas, and William. My sons, not our sons." The distinction was deliberate, unmistakable. "It's nice to meet you, sir," said the one she'd identified as Thomas, extending his hand. "Your work on the Richardson building was impressive." Richard shook his hand, feeling the firm grip that mirrored his own. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. Thomas had his eyes exactly, down to the particular shade of blue that had been passed down through generations of Caldwells. "Thank you," Richard replied, his voice not quite his own. "Are you interested in architecture?" "Engineering," James answered. He was the most serious of the three, his expression guarded. "We all are, actually. Triplets with the same major. It confuses our professors." Triplets. The word hit Richard like a physical blow. Not just one son, but three. 3 sons he'd never known existed. "You're all at the same university?" Richard asked, desperate to learn more. William, who had Richard's smile but Eleanor's warm eyes, nodded. "State. We're juniors." Richard struggled to process this information. 19 years old, engineering students, his sons, the family he'd abandoned Eleanor to create with someone else, except she had created it without him, from the very embryos they'd made together. "I'd like to," Richard began, but was interrupted by the shrill ring of his phone. He glanced at the screen, intending to silence it, but the caller ID made him pause. It was Martinez, his site foreman at Caldwell Plaza. "Excuse me," he said, stepping slightly away from the table. "Martinez, this isn't a good time." The frantic voice on the other end made Richard's blood run cold. "Sir, we've had a collapse in the East Wing Foundation. 3 workers are trapped. Fire department's on the way, but it doesn't look good. The whole structure is unstable." "I'll be right there," Richard said, ending the call and turning back to Eleanor and the triplets, who had overheard enough to look concerned. "There's been an accident at my construction site," he explained, his mind torn between the crisis and the desperate need to continue this conversation. "The Caldwell Plaza project?" Thomas asked, immediately alert. "What happened?" Before Richard could answer, James was already standing. "Foundation collapse? We just covered structural failure scenarios in advanced engineering last semester." "We should go," William added, looking at his brothers. "We might be able to help." Eleanor's expression showed concern, but not surprise, as if her son's immediate willingness to help was expected. "Boys, this isn't," Richard began, but they were already gathering their things. "We're coming with you," James said firmly, his tone brooking no argument, a tone Richard recognized from his own boardroom. "Mom, we'll call you," Thomas assured Eleanor, kissing her cheek. Eleanor nodded, her eyes meeting Richard's. "Be careful," she said, though it wasn't clear if she was addressing her sons or including him in the warning. Before Richard could process what was happening, the triplets were already heading for the exit, leaving him no choice but to follow his newly discovered sons into a crisis. The days following the gala blurred together for Richard. His mind constantly replayed the moment he'd first seen the triplets, his striking blue eyes multiplied across 3 young faces, his own gestures and expressions reflected back at him in triplicate. Sleep eluded him as questions raced through his thoughts. How was this possible? Why hadn't Eleanor told him? What did the boys know about him? His phone rang early Wednesday morning. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Caldwell? This is James Caldwell." The voice was confident, measured, unsettlingly like Richard's own. "My brothers and I are at your construction site. We've been reviewing the engineering reports and have some ideas about stabilizing the East Wing." Richard sat up straight. "You're at Caldwell Plaza? How did you get access?" "Your foreman, Martinez. We showed him our engineering credentials and explained that we'd discussed the situation with you at the gala." There was a pause. "We can leave if you prefer." "No," Richard said quickly. "No, I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Richard arrived, the scene was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the perimeter, and workers in hard hats moved with urgent purpose. He spotted the triplets immediately, huddled with Martinez over a set of blueprints spread across the hood of a truck. As Richard approached, he heard William explaining, "The problem isn't the main support beam, it's these secondary trusses. They're carrying more weight than they were designed for." "Which explains the partial collapse here," Thomas added, pointing to a section of the blueprint. Martinez noticed Richard first. "Mr. Caldwell, these young men really know their stuff. They've identified the weak points in our eastern structure." The triplets turned, and Richard was struck again by the mirror image quality of their faces, his face in younger form. "We've been helping coordinate with the rescue team," James explained. 2 workers have been extracted safely. 1 more to go. Before Richard could respond, a shout came from the building. A section of scaffolding was starting to tilt dangerously toward the rescue team. Without hesitation, the triplets sprinted toward the danger. Richard watched in astonishment as they worked in perfect synchrony, Thomas calculating load points, William directing workers to safety, and James improvising a temporary support system using materials at hand. "Shift that beam 10 degrees east," James called out, using the same commanding tone Richard recognized from his own crisis management. "Counterweight on the north corner," Thomas added, his quick calculations preventing a secondary collapse. Within minutes, the scaffolding was stabilized, and the rescue team successfully extracted the final worker. Richard stood transfixed, pride surging through him unexpectedly. These were his sons, unmistakably carrying his instincts, his problem-solving abilities, his decisive nature. As the immediate crisis subsided, Richard noticed Eleanor standing at the edge of the site, watching her sons with a mixture of worry and pride. He made his way to her side. "They're remarkable," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still on the triplets. "Yes, they are." "Eleanor," Richard began, his voice low and urgent. "I need to understand. How is this possible?" She finally turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Let's step away from the crowd." They walked to a quiet corner of the construction site, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground between them. "Do you remember our last round of fertility treatments?" Eleanor asked. "We had several viable embryos preserved." Richard nodded slowly. "I remember. After you left," her voice faltered slightly. "After the divorce was finalized, I received notification from the clinic. The embryos were legally mine." She met his gaze directly. "I made a choice, Richard. I found a surrogate. I wanted a family, the family we had planned together." Richard felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. They're mine? Biologically?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, they're your biological sons. Our sons." "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. "Tell you." Eleanor's composure cracked. "You made your choice very clear. You left me because I couldn't give you children. You wanted biological heirs more than you wanted our marriage." A tear slipped down her cheek. "So I gave myself the children we had dreamed of, and I raised them alone. I protected them from knowing their biological father had abandoned them before they were even born." Richard stared at her, the full weight of his past decisions crashing down upon him. The sons he had left Eleanor for had been there all along, created from their love, raised without him, now grown into exceptional young men. "They don't know?" he asked. "No," Eleanor whispered. "They believe their father was a sperm donor. They've never asked for more than that." Richard stumbled into his penthouse well past midnight, his mind still reeling from Eleanor's revelation. He loosened his tie with trembling fingers and poured himself a scotch, barely noticing when some spilled onto the marble countertop. The triplets, his sons, had worked tirelessly at the construction site until the situation was fully stabilized. He'd watched them from a distance, seeing himself in their determined expressions, their methodical problem-solving, even the way they stood with hands on hips when assessing a challenge. His sons. The thought hammered at him with each heartbeat. Richard moved to his study and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, a space he rarely visited. Inside lay a polished wooden box, untouched for nearly 2 decades. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface before lifting the lid. The memories spilled out, photographs of Eleanor laughing on their honeymoon, her hair blowing in the Mediterranean breeze, handwritten letters they'd exchanged during his early business trips, the deed to their first small house. Each item unleashed emotions he'd suppressed for years. At the bottom of the box, beneath an envelope of wedding photos, he found a folder of medical documents. Richard spread them across his desk, scanning the papers with increasing urgency until he found it. The fertility clinic consent forms with both their signatures. The document clearly outlined the preservation of multiple embryos and the legal provisions regarding their ownership. "I completely forgot," he whispered to the empty room. One line stood out starkly. In the event of divorce or separation, preserved embryos remain the property of the female patient unless otherwise specified by court order. Richard slumped back in his chair. The children he'd abandoned Eleanor for had existed all along, frozen in potential, waiting for life. And Eleanor had given them that life. Without him. He stared at a photo of Eleanor on their 5th anniversary, her eyes filled with love as she gazed at him across a candle-lit table. "What have I done?" he murmured, touching her face in the photograph. Across town, Bernard Whitaker reviewed security footage from Richard's construction site on his tablet. His cold gray eyes narrowed with interest as he watched the 3 young men directing rescue operations alongside Caldwell. "Pause there," he instructed his assistant. The screen froze on a perfect profile shot of the triplets standing next to Richard. "The resemblance is remarkable, isn't it?" His assistant nodded. "They could be his sons." "Find out everything about them," Bernard said, a calculating smile forming. "School records, social media, family connections. Everything." He tapped his manicured fingernails against his desk. "Richard Caldwell with secret children. This is exactly the leverage I've been waiting for." Bernard had spent 2 decades watching Richard succeed where he had faltered, winning contracts Bernard coveted, receiving accolades Bernard craved. Now, finally, he sensed vulnerability in his rival's perfect facade. "Sir, preliminary search shows they're enrolled at MIT engineering students, all 3. Their mother is Eleanor Caldwell, Richard's ex-wife." Bernard's smile widened. "How very interesting. Dig deeper. I want to know if Richard knew about them, how long they've been in contact, everything. There's a story here, and I intend to use it." 2 days later, Richard sat in a quiet corner of Maison Café, fidgeting with his coffee cup as he waited. When Eleanor entered, her composure was evident in every graceful step. She wore a simple blue dress that accentuated her eyes that had once looked at him with complete trust. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard said as she took the seat across from him. Eleanor nodded. "The boys asked about you. They were impressed by how quickly you organized resources at the site." "They're extraordinary, Eleanor. You've done an amazing job raising them." A soft smile touched her lips. "They've been my whole world." Richard gathered his courage. "I've been thinking about nothing else since that night. I found the fertility clinic documents. I had completely forgotten about the embryos during the divorce." "I hadn't," Eleanor said simply. "I need to ask you something," Richard said, his voice dropping lower. "In 19 years, did you ever remarry?" Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands. "No." "Why not?" Richard asked, hardly daring to breathe. When she looked up, the vulnerability in her eyes stunned him. "I told myself it was because the boys needed my full attention. That was partly true." She took a deep breath. "But if I'm being honest, a part of me never stopped loving you, Richard, despite everything." The admission hung between them, as fragile and precious as blown glass. "Even after I betrayed you," Richard whispered. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The heart doesn't always listen to reason. I've spent 19 years trying to forget you, but seeing you with our sons the other night." She shook her head. "Some connections can't be broken, even when we want them to be." Richard sat in his office, tapping his pen against a stack of contracts as he stared out at the city skyline. The triplets' engineering brilliance during the crisis had left a profound impression. After several sleepless nights, he'd made his decision. "Ms. Chen," he called to his assistant through the intercom, "please arrange a meeting with the Caldwell boys for tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to discuss potential internship opportunities." When James, Thomas, and William arrived at Caldwell Enterprises the following day, Richard found himself searching their faces for traces of himself. James had his analytical mind, Thomas his confident stance, and William his thoughtful expression. All 3 carried themselves with Eleanor's grace. "Your quick thinking saved lives at my construction site," Richard told them, maintaining a professional demeanor despite his racing heart. "I'd like to offer you summer internships in our engineering division. Your academic records are impressive, and we could use minds like yours." The brothers exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way only siblings could. "That's generous, Mr. Caldwell," James replied, the most outspoken of the three. "But why us specifically? MIT has hundreds of engineering students." Richard had prepared for this question. "Few of them demonstrated practical crisis management the way you three did. That's something that can't be taught in classrooms." William, the most perceptive triplet, studied Richard's face. "Our mother mentioned you knew each other years ago." Richard nodded carefully. "We did. It was before you were born." "She doesn't talk much about that time in her life," Thomas added. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," Richard said, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. "I'd like to invite her to discuss the internship details as well, if that's appropriate." The following week, Eleanor joined them for lunch in Richard's private conference room. Watching her interact with their sons filled Richard with bittersweet wonder. She anticipated their needs before they voiced them, laughed at inside jokes he wasn't privy to, and gently redirected William's tendency to overthink with a simple touch on his arm. "Remember when you flooded Mrs. Abernathy's basement with your water filtration experiment?" Eleanor teased Thomas, who groaned dramatically. "Mom, please. I was 12, and the design was sound. I just miscalculated the water pressure." "You've always been our practical inventor," she said fondly. "James plans everything meticulously. William considers all angles, and you, Thomas, make things happen." Richard recognized himself in each description. As the lunch progressed, he found himself leaning forward, absorbing every story. "You coached their robotics team?" he asked when Eleanor mentioned a state championship. "For 7 years," she nodded. "I learned enough engineering terminology to sound knowledgeable at least." "She's being modest," James interjected. "Mom took night classes in basic engineering principles just to help us. She slept maybe 4 hours a night that whole year." Richard's admiration deepened. "That's dedication." "They were worth every minute," Eleanor said simply, her eyes meeting Richard's. Something electric passed between them, a recognition of shared pride that transcended their complicated past. As the internship program began, Richard found legitimate reasons to meet with Eleanor. They reviewed the boys' progress, discussed their strengths, planned their professional development. Each meeting lasted longer than necessary. During one such meeting, they both reached for the same folder. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. The contact lasted only seconds, but it sent warmth spreading through Richard's chest. "Do you remember that little Italian restaurant in Cambridge?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Richard smiled. "Where we got stuck in that terrible rainstorm. The owner gave us towels and free tiramisu. You said it was the best dessert you'd ever had because I was sharing it with you," Richard finished. Their eyes locked, the memory hanging between them. Meanwhile, Bernard Whitaker sat in his sleek downtown office, reviewing reports from his private investigator. Photos of Richard with the triplets and Eleanor spread across his desk. "Fascinating," Bernard murmured, examining a picture of Richard looking at Eleanor with unmistakable longing. The great Richard Caldwell, reconnecting with the family he abandoned. He picked up his phone. "Contact our sources at the building department. I want a complete review of the structural modifications Caldwell made after the accident. Find me something, anything, that doesn't meet code." His cold smile widened. "And arrange a meeting with those environmental activists who opposed his riverfront development. Tell them I have information that might interest them." Bernard set down the phone, satisfaction coursing through him. "You've built your empire on your reputation, Richard," he said to the empty room. "Let's see how it stands when that foundation crumbles." The next day, James frowned as he watched Richard guiding William through the blueprints of the Riverside Tower project. There was something too personal about the way Richard corrected his brother's calculations, something that went beyond professional mentorship. The older man's eyes lit up with unmistakable pride when William solved a complex structural problem. "Exactly right," Richard said, his voice warm with approval. "That's precisely how I would have approached it." James crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe of the conference room. He'd noticed this pattern repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. Richard's intense interest in their lives, the questions about their childhood, the way his gaze lingered on them with an expression James couldn't quite place. Later that evening, James confronted his brothers in their shared apartment near campus. "Don't you think it's weird, the way Caldwell's always watching us?" James paced the living room. "It's like he's studying us." Thomas shrugged, barely looking up from his textbook. "He's investing in our futures. Of course he's evaluating us." "It's more than that," James insisted. "And have you noticed how often he and Mom are talking now? They're constantly texting." William set down his coffee mug. "I did see something strange yesterday. There was a man taking photos of us leaving the building. When I looked directly at him, he walked away quickly." "Probably just press," Thomas suggested. "Caldwell's always in the business news." James shook his head. "I don't think so. Something's going on." His suspicions intensified the following day when a delivery truck nearly struck Thomas in the company parking garage, missing him by inches. The driver sped away before anyone could identify him. That night, Richard received a panicked call from Eleanor. "Someone followed the boys home from campus," she said, her voice tight with fear. James noticed the same car 3 different times. "Richard, I'm worried." "I'll be right over," he said without hesitation. 20 minutes later, Richard sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the familiarity of the setting striking him powerfully. Her home was warm and lived in, filled with photographs of the boys through various stages of their lives, pictures of a family he should have been part of. "It could be connected to Bernard Whitaker," Richard explained, running a hand through his hair. "He's been unusually aggressive lately, digging into my projects, my personal life." Eleanor poured them both tea, her hands slightly unsteady. "Why would he target the boys?" "To get to me, perhaps. He might have discovered their connection to me somehow." Richard paused, watching her face carefully. "I've hired security to monitor them discreetly." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you." They spent hours developing a safety plan, their old rhythms of problem-solving returning naturally. Richard found himself marveling at how easily they still worked together, finishing each other's thoughts, anticipating concerns. "We should establish a code word," Eleanor suggested. "Something the boys can text if they feel threatened." "Lighthouse," Richard said immediately. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You remember?" "Our safe place," he nodded. "The lighthouse on Cape Cod where we spent our first anniversary." A comfortable silence fell between them. Eleanor glanced at the clock, past midnight. "I should find those campus maps to mark the security points," she said, standing. "They're in my office." Richard followed her down the hallway to a small room lined with bookshelves. As Eleanor searched through a drawer, Richard noticed a familiar leather box on the highest shelf. His breath caught. It was his old writing box, the one he'd left behind when he moved out 19 years ago. "Eleanor," he said quietly. "Is that my box?" She froze, following his gaze. "Richard, He reached for it before she could object, opening it carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to Eleanor in his handwriting. Letters he had written over years of separation but never sent. Reflections on his regrets, updates on his life, questions about hers. "How did you get these?" he whispered. "I never mailed them." Eleanor's cheeks flushed. "Your assistant, Margaret. She found them in your desk drawer years ago. She thought I should have them." Richard stared at her in disbelief. You've read them all. Many times, Eleanor admitted softly. They're why I never fully closed the door on you in my heart, even after everything. Richard pulled out one letter dated 10 years earlier. I miss the sound of your laughter, he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Today I accomplished everything I thought I wanted, and found myself turning to tell you first. Their eyes met over the box of undelivered feelings, decades of unspoken truths hanging in the air between them. You kept them all, Richard said, wonder and vulnerability mingling in his voice. I couldn't let them go, Eleanor whispered, just like I couldn't completely let you go. Moments later, Richard paced the hospital corridor, his footsteps echoing against the sterile tile floor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of worry etched there. Every few moments, he checked his watch, then glanced toward the treatment room where Thomas was being examined. The accident had happened so quickly. Thomas had been inspecting the structural reinforcements at the Westlake Tower site when a support beam inexplicably gave way. If not for his quick reflexes, he might have been killed instead of suffering a broken arm and concussion. Eleanor sat rigidly in a nearby chair, her face pale, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. James and William stood nearby, conferring in low, tense voices. Family of Thomas Caldwell? The doctor's voice cut through the tension. Eleanor shot to her feet. Yes, I'm his mother. Richard stepped forward automatically, standing at her side. The doctor glanced between them, making an assumption that neither corrected. He's stable. The concussion is mild, and we've set his arm. He's asking for his family. Relief washed over Eleanor's face. As they followed the doctor, Richard's hand found the small of her back in a gesture so natural, it surprised them both. Thomas looked smaller somehow in the hospital bed, his normally confident expression replaced by discomfort and frustration. His left arm was encased in a cast, and a butterfly bandage crossed his forehead. Hey, Mom, he said, attempting a smile. Sorry about the scare. Eleanor rushed to his side, brushing his hair back with trembling fingers. Don't you dare apologize. What happened? Thomas frowned. Something wasn't right with that support beam. I noticed unusual stress patterns in the metal. I was taking photos when it gave way. Richard stepped closer. Those beams were inspected last week. They were certified safe. Someone tampered with them, Thomas said firmly. I'd stake my degree on it. James and William exchanged meaningful glances. We found something similar yesterday, William admitted. Inconsistencies in the building plans versus the executed designs. Why didn't you tell me? Richard demanded. We were verifying our findings first, James explained. We didn't want to make accusations without proof. Hours later, after tests and paperwork, the doctor recommended Thomas stay overnight for observation. The brothers reluctantly agreed to go home for rest and clean clothes, promising to return in the morning. As midnight approached, only Richard and Eleanor remained in the dimly lit hospital room. Thomas had finally drifted off to sleep, the pain medication taking effect. You don't have to stay, Eleanor whispered to Richard across the bed. I'm not leaving, he replied simply. The weight of the day suddenly crashed down on Eleanor. Her shoulders began to shake, and tears she'd been holding back all evening spilled down her cheeks. Richard moved around the bed without hesitation, drawing her into his arms. She stiffened momentarily before collapsing against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. He could have died, she sobbed quietly. My boy could have died. But he didn't, Richard murmured into her hair, his arms tightening around her. He's strong, Eleanor, like his mother. They stood that way for long minutes, the beeping of the monitors providing a steady backdrop to their shared fear and relief. When Eleanor's tears finally subsided, Richard guided her to the small couch in the corner of the room. Try to rest, he said gently. I'll keep watch." Exhaustion overtook her, and Eleanor found herself leaning against Richard's shoulder, her body remembering the comfort of his presence despite the years between them. Richard remained perfectly still, afraid to disturb the fragile peace between them. He didn't realize he'd dozed off until the soft click of the door woke him. James and William stood in the doorway, staring at the tableau before them. Their mother asleep against Richard's shoulder, his arm protectively around her, his free hand resting near Thomas's bed as if keeping watch over them both. William's expression was unreadable, but James's eyes narrowed with suspicion. They backed out quietly, closing the door behind them. "I'm researching him tonight," William whispered in the hallway. "Every article, every business deal, every personal detail I can find." "There's something they're not telling us," James agreed, casting one more glance at the door. Meanwhile, inside the room, Richard gazed down at Eleanor's sleeping face, then over at Thomas. For the first time in 19 years, he felt the fierce protectiveness of family and the absolute certainty that Bernard Whitaker was behind the accident. The sabotage the boys had discovered confirmed his worst fears. Richard carefully extracted his phone without disturbing Eleanor and sent a text to his security team. Full protection detail on all 3 Caldwell boys and Eleanor, 24/7, no exceptions. He would protect his family, and he would save his company from Bernard's machinations. The 2 missions had become inseparable in his mind, just as his heart had finally recognized what truly mattered. Few days after Thomas was discharged from the hospital, the triplets huddled around William's laptop in their mother's kitchen, their faces illuminated by the screen's blue glow. 3 days had passed since Thomas's release from the hospital, and the brothers had barely slept, diving into research about Richard Caldwell. "Look at this," William said, pointing to an old newspaper clipping. "Mom and Caldwell's wedding announcement from 22 years ago." James leaned closer. "That's definitely Mom. She looks so young." "And here's the divorce filing," William continued, scrolling to another document. 19 years ago, right before we were born." Thomas, his arm still in a cast, reached for a folder they'd discovered in their mother's attic while searching for more information about the sabotage at Richard's building. Inside were photographs, Richard and Eleanor laughing on a beach, at a restaurant, dancing at what appeared to be a wedding. "The timeline matches perfectly," Thomas said quietly. "And look at us, then look at him." The front door opened, and Eleanor's voice called out, "Boys? I'm home early." The meeting was canceled. The triplets exchanged glances. James nodded grimly. Eleanor walked into the kitchen, her smile fading as she took in their serious expressions. Her eyes fell to the photographs spread across the table, and the color drained from her face. "Mom," William said gently, "we need to talk about Richard Caldwell." Eleanor sank into a chair. "How did you find these?" "That's not the question," James said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The question is Richard Caldwell our father?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with 19 years of unspoken truth. "Yes," Eleanor finally whispered. "Biologically, yes, he is." Thomas slammed his good hand on the table. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years?" "Because he left me when he found out I couldn't have children," Eleanor said, tears welling in her eyes. "He wanted biological heirs for his empire, and when my infertility was diagnosed, he walked away from our marriage." "But we exist," William pointed out, ever the logical one. Eleanor explained about the embryos, the surrogacy, her decision to raise them alone. "I never told him about you because he made his choice. He chose his ambition over our family. And now he's wormed his way back in," James said bitterly, "offering us internships, getting close to you again." "That's not fair," Eleanor interrupted. "He had no idea you existed until he saw you at that gala." The shock on his face was genuine. Thomas ran his fingers over one of the photographs. "All those times he asked about our childhood. He was trying to understand what he missed. The doorbell rang, startling them all. "That's him," Eleanor said. "I asked him to come over. I thought it was time we all talked." James stood abruptly. "I'm not staying for this." "Yes, you are," Eleanor said firmly. "You wanted the truth. Now you'll hear all of it." When Richard entered the kitchen, the tension was palpable. His eyes moved from the photographs on the table to the triplets' faces, understanding immediately. "They know," he said quietly to Eleanor. "Yes." Richard took a deep breath. "I owe you all an explanation." "You owe us 19 years, James snapped. "James," Eleanor warned. "No, he's right," Richard said. "I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left your mother. I convinced myself that legacy meant creating biological heirs, but I was wrong. Legacy is about the impact you leave on the world and the people in it." "Pretty words," James muttered. "Not just words," Richard countered. He pulled out his phone, opened an email, and placed it on the table. "This is the foundation I've funded anonymously for 15 years. It supports families struggling with infertility, funds surrogacy for those who can't afford it, and provides counseling for couples facing what your mother and I faced." William picked up the phone, scrolling through the foundation's records. "The Caldwell Foundation for Family Creation," he read. "You've helped hundreds of families." "It doesn't erase what I did," Richard said, looking directly at Eleanor. "Nothing could. But when I realized the magnitude of my mistake, I wanted to prevent others from making the same one." Eleanor's expression softened. "You never told me about this." "I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy forgiveness," Richard replied. "Some debts can't be paid with money." Thomas looked between his biological parents. "So what happens now?" "That's up to you three," Richard said. "I've missed 19 years of your lives. I don't expect to be welcomed as your father overnight, or maybe ever. But I'd like the chance to know you, if you'll allow it." James stood up, shaking his head. "I need time," he said, before walking out of the room. Thomas extended his uninjured hand to Richard. "I'm willing to try." William nodded thoughtfully. "Same here, but right now we have more pressing concerns. Someone's targeting your company, and by extension, us. We should focus on that first." Richard grasped Thomas's hand, emotion evident in his eyes. "Thank you, both of you." Eleanor watched the exchange, her heart both breaking and healing at once. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in 19 years, it existed. Days after, Bernard Whitaker's smile was cold as he watched the final preparations for the grand opening of Caldwell Tower from across the street. The gleaming 80-story skyscraper represented everything he'd always resented about Richard Caldwell: his success, his vision, his seemingly unstoppable rise. The building was more than just Richard's latest achievement. It was the culmination of the empire he'd chosen over his marriage to Eleanor 19 years ago. "Is everything in place?" Bernard asked the man beside him, never taking his eyes off the building. "Yes, sir. The system vulnerabilities have been exploited. When you give the word, we can trigger catastrophic failures in the environmental controls, elevators, and security systems." Bernard checked his watch. "The grand opening begins in 1 hour. Richard and his newfound family should be arriving any minute for their private tour before the guests arrive." His lips curved into a smirk. "Let's give them a proper welcome." Inside Caldwell Tower's expansive lobby, Richard beamed with pride as he led Eleanor and the triplets through the space. Despite the tension still lingering with James, all three young men had agreed to attend the opening. William and Thomas out of growing warmth toward Richard, James primarily to support his mother. "This building incorporates every innovation in sustainable architecture," Richard explained, pointing out features as they walked. "It's been my dream project for nearly 2 decades." Eleanor gazed up at the soaring atrium. "It's magnificent, Richard. Truly." Their eyes met, and the ghost of their shared past hovered between them. How this very building, or rather the ambition it represented, had once been deemed more important than their marriage. The moment was interrupted by Richard's phone ringing. His face darkened as he listened. "What do you mean? System failures. We triple-checked everything yesterday." He glanced at the triplets. "Yes, I have 3 brilliant engineers with me now. We'll head up immediately." In the main control room on the 78th floor, chaos reigned. Technicians frantically worked at terminals while warning lights flashed across multiple screens. "Environmental systems are failing throughout the building," the chief engineer explained. "Temperature controls, ventilation, elevator safety mechanisms, they're all going haywire, and we're locked out of the override protocols." William immediately moved to a terminal. "This is deliberate sabotage. Someone's introduced cascading system failures with a time delay." "Can you stop it?" Richard asked. Thomas joined his brother. "Maybe, but we need to split up. These systems are physically separated for safety. Someone needs to manually reset the primary junctions on floors 30, 55, and the basement." "I'll take the basement," James volunteered, surprising everyone. "I'll handle 30, Thomas said. "And I'll take 55, William finished. Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. His face paled as he read it. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, moving to his side. Richard showed her the screen. "Enjoying my gift, Richard. Your precious tower or your precious sons. You can't save both. Choose better than you did 19 years ago. Bernard." "He's targeting the boys," Eleanor whispered, horror dawning on her face. Richard straightened, his decision immediate and unwavering. "Call security," he ordered the chief engineer. "Full evacuation now. Cancel the opening." "But sir, the investors, the press, everyone's already arriving," the man protested. "I don't care," Richard said firmly. "Eleanor, call the boys back, tell them to abort, and get out of the building immediately." As Eleanor made the calls, Richard strode to the emergency announcement system. His voice echoed throughout the entire structure. "Attention all personnel and early arrivals. This is Richard Caldwell. Due to a security threat, we are evacuating immediately. This is not a drill." He turned to Eleanor, who was shaking her head. "The boys won't leave. They say they can fix this if they work together." Richard's face hardened with determination. "Then I'm going after them." "Richard, no. I will not lose them now," he said, taking her hands. "Not when I've just found them. That building down there, it's just steel and glass. But our sons, they're everything I should have valued 19 years ago." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the transformation in the man before her, the man she had always believed Richard could become. In the lobby, bewildered investors and reporters watched as Richard rushed toward the service elevators, followed by security personnel. One persistent reporter blocked his path. "Mr. Caldwell, what's happening? Is this some publicity stunt?" Richard stopped, his patience gone. "My sons are in danger, James, Thomas, and William Caldwell. Yes, they're my sons. And right now, they're trying to save this building at the risk of their own lives because someone is targeting me through them. Now get out of my way." The reporter stepped back, stunned, as Richard pushed past, publicly acknowledging the triplets as his sons for the first time. As he entered the service elevator, Richard caught a glimpse of Eleanor's face. Her expression held something he hadn't seen directed at him in 19 years. Pride, and perhaps something more. In the 3 weeks following Bernard's dramatic arrest, the Caldwell family had barely had time to breathe. The press had swarmed around the revelation of Richard's long-lost sons. Bernard's corporate espionage had triggered investigations across multiple companies, and the triplets had finished their semester exams amid the chaos. Through it all, Richard and Eleanor had worked side by side, their old rhythms returning with surprising ease. On a clear evening in June, Richard drove Eleanor to Overlook Point, the hillside park where they'd spent countless evenings during their courtship. The city spread below them, lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. "I haven't been here in years," Eleanor admitted, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as they walked to the stone bench they'd once considered theirs. Richard nodded. "Neither have I. It never felt right to come back without you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Richard seemed nervous, his fingers tapping against his knee. "Eleanor," he finally said, turning to face her. "I've spent 19 years building towers and empires, thinking they would somehow fill the hole I created when I walked away from us." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Richard, please," he said gently. "I need to say this." He slid off the bench and knelt before her on one knee. Eleanor's breath caught. "I'm not offering a ring," he clarified quickly. "Not yet. That would be presumptuous after everything." He withdrew an envelope from his jacket. "This is something else entirely." Eleanor took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a legal document with her name prominently displayed. "The Eleanor Caldwell Family Foundation," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's fully funded with $50 million, Richard explained, dedicated to helping families struggling with fertility treatments, surrogacy costs, adoption expenses, whatever path they choose to build their family." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she continued reading. "I made the worst mistake of my life when I believed biology was more important than love," Richard continued, still on one knee. "I can't undo the pain I caused, but I can try to prevent others from facing the same impossible choices." Eleanor's hand moved to her neck, fingers finding the thin gold chain hidden beneath her blouse. She pulled it out, revealing a simple gold wedding band that gleamed in the fading light. "I never could bring myself to get rid of it," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "Even when I was angriest, even when I thought I hated you, I kept it close to my heart." Richard stared at the ring, his composure finally breaking. "All these years?" Eleanor nodded. "All these years." He rose from his knee to sit beside her again, tentatively taking her hand. "I don't deserve a second chance, Eleanor." "Maybe not," she agreed, squeezing his fingers. "But our sons deserve to see that love can endure even the worst mistakes. And maybe I deserve the chance to love the man I never stopped loving, even when I wanted to." 2 evenings later, the Caldwell family gathered around Eleanor's dining table. The triplets had insisted on cooking dinner, a chaotic affair that had filled the house with laughter and the occasional minor disaster. "Dad," William said, the word still new on his tongue, "we have something for you." Richard looked up in surprise. It was the first time any of the boys had called him Dad, unprompted. Thomas placed a cardboard tube on the table. "It's belated, but Happy Father's Day." James, still the most reserved of the three, nodded his agreement. "It was his idea, actually," he admitted, nodding toward his brother. With uncharacteristically unsteady hands, Richard opened the tube and unrolled the architectural plans inside. His eyes widened as he studied the detailed drawings. "These are," he began, voice failing him. "Affordable family homes," William explained, "designed to be built on that empty lot you own in Riverside. We know you've been wanting to diversify your portfolio beyond luxury developments," Thomas added. "And Mom mentioned how you two used to talk about building communities, not just buildings," James said quietly. Richard stared at the plans, unable to speak as emotion overwhelmed him. The designs were brilliant, innovative, efficient, and beautiful in their simplicity. But more than that, they represented acceptance from his sons. Eleanor watched the play of emotions across Richard's face, her heart full. Beneath the table, she reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, comfortably, like two pieces of a puzzle finding their match after being separated for too long. Richard looked up at his family, the sons he'd nearly lost before knowing them, and the woman he'd never stopped loving, and felt, for the first time in 19 years, truly complete. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how hard. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.